Yes, Ukraine matters. There's no doubt that a country which is the largest country by area that's physically entirely within Europe, that is the largest economy, that is neither part of the EU, nor is it part of NATO, nor is it part of Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. This is, in a sense, a country that's trapped in the gray areas in between, and yet it's an enormous economy. And then potential, right? This is a place, 45, 46 million people, great educational background, hard workers, entrepreneurial. It's got 70% of the so-called black earth, the most fertile soil in Europe. So Ukraine is a powerhouse no matter how you cut the cake, and yet it's not really integrated yet. The paradox of reform in Ukraine is that no reform that's driven by the government is ever going to be enough. There's kind of a chicken and egg problem, which is that the people of the country determine whether reform can succeed and whether corruption can be eliminated because it takes two to tango. It's not only the official who asks for the bribe, but it's the business person or the citizen or the person stopped in traffic who pays the bribe. And I think to change that culture, a beginning of it, of course, could be things like exchanges, getting more young Ukrainians into Western Europe, to the United States, so that they have different expectations. Even sending them to places like Georgia, where corruption has been tackled relatively effectively, or at least the process has started. But the much deeper change, of course, is going to happen by building institutions. And that is, promoting the rule of institutions and the rule of law over the rule of individuals. And that's a process. It takes time. I think this government has done a little bit of it. Previous governments have done a little bit of it. But there hasn't been really a sea change moment in Ukraine yet, and we're still waiting. Ukraine's economic success, relative economic success over the past several years, and then if you look back a decade before that, has been kind of an artifact of unique circumstances. Either there's been a good harvest, and so Ukraine has done well, or global steel prices have gone up, and Ukraine, being a big steel producer, has therefore done well. Or if you go back 10 years, it was that European banks were finally starting to pay attention to Ukraine, and so all of a sudden there was all this credit, and people who had never borrowed are now borrowing and they're spending, therefore, and so Ukraine was doing well. And the thing is, after a while, you kind of run out of these artifacts. Ukraine starts to look like a regular country, and then it has problems that regular countries have. And so I think it's going to have to look for much more normalized, much more integrated solutions. And those are going to depend on institutional restructuring, institutional reform, balancing the budget, fiscal consolidation, all of the kind of hard stuff, austerity, that terrible buzzword that Europe is afraid of these days. And this is hard stuff. And it's particularly hard stuff when you're going into a parliamentary election like Ukraine is doing at the end of 2012. It's hard to see how that success story really accelerates between now and let's say 2012, 2013. And Yanukovych, of course, the president of Ukraine, is in a sort of political pressure cooker, feeling pressure from all sides. Ukraine, being the incoming OSCE chair in office, is actually already involved in the so-called troika of the previous chair, the current chair, and the incoming chair. So it should already be playing a role in terms of managing the security space of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But the whole purpose of OSCE is to acknowledge the fact that security comes in multiple forms. You have human security, economic security, and then traditional politico-military security. And so I think Ukraine has got to demonstrate that it understands that sort of multidimensionality of security, but also that it has a unique comparative advantage. And what is that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine is in the gray space. It is not a NATO member. But it is also not part of Russia's or Russia-led security alliances. So it has this unique perspective to understand what it means to be a non-bloc country in the Euro-Atlantic space. And that should give it a special incentive to make the Euro-Atlantic system as a whole, the system that includes Russia on the one hand, but also North America and traditional NATO allies on the other hand, a more meaningful system, so strengthening Euro-Atlantic security. It also has a real incentive to deal with protracted conflicts. The conflict in Transnistria is more Ukraine's problem, quite frankly, than anyone else's. Certainly it's Moldova's problem. It's a breakaway territory of Moldova. But Ukraine is the other party on the other border, and Ukraine is going to be saddled with the problem if Moldova enters Europe. Moldova is on the path to enter Europe without Transnistria, because the Transnistrians will look to their immediate neighbor, their former Soviet neighbor, and say, look, you guys have to help us out. And so the Ukrainians, I think, have a real incentive to move forward on Transnistria. And then lastly, there are these sort of 21st century challenges where actually Ukraine has much greater capacity and much greater challenges than many other countries. Trafficking. Ukraine is basically the northern coast of the Black Sea. That's Ukrainian territory, and the Black Sea is the major highway between the Middle East and the instability of the Arab world today and greater AfPak, that whole region. That's how it flows up into Europe, and Ukraine is right there at the entry point. Global health pandemics, right? Ukraine has massive health capabilities, but they're crumbling. They're Soviet era. And it's got a population that's very vulnerable to drug-resistant TB and other epidemics. And then cyber. Ukraine has actually been the source of both a number of major global cyber attacks, but also the solutions. The government can draw upon very skilled, technically skilled Ukrainians to try and deal with the problems of cyber insecurity, and I think it needs to do a more effective job of bringing Ukraine into a globally integrated system in that respect.